The reading for this morning is Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4, just the first 6 verses. From verse 1 then, chapter 4. I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all, through all, and in you all. Amen. Amen. Just a short reading this morning. Carrying on from our previous studies for Ephesians. Last week we looked at some glorious little verses that talked about the fullness of God that was there to dwell in us. But if we were to look at the letter that Paul writes, we've broken it up into 6 chapters. And chapters 1 to 3 really talk about our position in Christ, sitting. We are sitting in heavenly places. And then it talks in chapters 4 to 5 about moving from sitting to walking. The great emphasis of chapter 4 to 5 is walking. And then finally in chapter 6 we find that we are not to walk, we're to standing. It's from there that Watchman Nee, the famous Chinese evangelist, pastor, wrote his classic Sit, Walk, and Stand, from those phrases that are found within the letter. But in sitting, we're there receiving. In walking, we're there revealing. And in standing, we're there resisting. And so really we find in these chapters, Paul just breaks it down. When we sit in heavenly places with Christ, we are to receive from him. When we walk before him, we are to reveal him. And when we stand, then we are to resist that which would try to undermine him and undermine his work. So it's receiving, revealing, and resisting. And as I mentioned, after the glories of last week's verses, where we talked about the being strengthened in the inner man by the Spirit of God, and also with that then learning that we are to be indwelt with by Christ, we found at the very end that we are to be filled with all the fullness of God. It's an amazing statement to make, to be full of the fullness of God. Someone mentioned in the week that I could have, or perhaps should have, made an appeal towards the end of the service. Well, Paul certainly did make an appeal, because the next verse he says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you, encourage you, exhort you. And so this is where there's a change from moving from what we understand that we are to be in Christ to understanding now what we are supposed to do in Christ. It moves from being to doing, from believing to acting upon, or duty, whichever way you want to call it. We can find here that God moves us on now. We're not just to sit forever and to receive forever, although that's an ongoing process. We're to be a people that are to walk. It's time to move. That's the title of the sermon. With all the different things that we spoke of last week, and in the weeks before, talking about the power and strength of Almighty God in our lives, there's an immediate connection between those verses that we looked at last week and this chapter, especially when we begin to move down into later verses where it talks about the work of God, the ministry, the place in the church of God that God has given to you. And people immediately link up that this is what this chapter is all about. Well, yes, it is. It is in that regard, but it is secondary. It is secondary. It is not the real reason or the heart of the reason why that power, that strength, that dynamic that can come within a believer's life, it's not just for doing something. It's for being something. And so we find here with Paul, he writes, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that you walk worthy of the call with which you've been called. In the King James Version, it talks about vocation. not vacation, but vocation. And immediately, people tend to think about work. When you talk about what is your vocation, Joseph is going to study soon for his vocation in life. What is his calling or what is his work in life? But the vocation here has nothing to do at this point with what he's going to do when Paul's writing this. It's not about what these people are going to do, it's what they're going to be. And so the power of God is brought to us for certain reasons that are uppermost in Paul's mind and in the heart of God as well, that he's urging them to move on. Last Sunday we looked at the fullness of God. Today, this Sunday, we're looking at the character of God. Next week, we look at the work of God, because they all link in with each other. And sometimes what we want to do is put the cart before the horse, that type of thing? We try to do things without really understanding what we are really supposed to do. So the fullness of God, then the character of God, then the work of God, the place that God has given to you for your service in the church. Now I know there are some lofty titles in later verses, the apostle, the prophet, the evangelist, the pastor and teacher. But when we go to other books within the New Testament, there shows that there are a whole range of gifts that God gives to his people. One gift is this, the gift of giving cheerfully. The gift of giving. That's a wonderful gift, not a gift we get. You wouldn't think God would need to do that, but he gives a gift of giving sometimes. And so there's so many different gifts that we can look at that Paul in his letters to other churches writes about. So let's have a look then. Time to move. Verse 2 tells us, walk with all lowliness and gentleness, with long-suffering, forbearing one another in love. These are the 4 things that Paul, or 5 things really, that Paul talks about, that is to have an immediate impact on our life when we take or taste of the fullness of God. The first one, lowliness. We would know it better as humility. Of all the attributes that a man would, or a woman, or a child would have, in the ancient world, if there was one attribute that was despised, it was humility. It was looked upon that you could be almost a doormat to be walked upon when you were considered humble. The adjective used in the former days, the adjective for this word humility, was used to describe a plant that creeped along the ground, something like ivy. I was up on the embankment yesterday, not too far up, so I wouldn't get a summons from the transport police, but down the bottom end. Oh, hello, Nige. Good to see you, Nige. You're not going to sneak in without an hello, because you sneak out without a goodbye. There we are. There we are. Good to see you, Nige. Where was I? A plant that creeps along the floor. Now, I was up on the bank, and I was there with a little hoe, and I was moving brambles that were showing itself, but this ivy that was creeping along the floor all the time. Now, that's the type of thing that the ancient world thought of humility, something that creeps along the ground. And yet, it's strange, really, because it's the Christian church that have coined this word that has come here and adapted it so that it refers to someone that is like Christ. Humility, lowly of heart. You wouldn't think the power of God would be to do that, wouldn't you? But you know, sometimes I can be so arrogant that I need the power of God to bring me low. And very often we find it's the opposite with David. He says, Lord, not your power has made me great, but your gentleness has made me great. But here we have the power of God that we spoke of last week. And one of the forefront things that it's to do to affect our lives is to bring the spirit of humility, lowliness, despised in the ancient world. Certainly frowned upon today, not something that would be pushed at the forefront of philosophy today for individuals to be humble. It's a go-getter's world. It's a world of where the early bird catches the worm and all these things. Nothing about humility at all. Then it goes on about meekness. Meekness. I think it's got there gentleness, but I think in the Authorized, meekness is the phrase that's used. It refers to a domesticated animal that is under or has been broken so that it can be controlled. That's a lovely phrase, isn't it? A domesticated animal. I remember seeing Kath and Sharon Tyler when they had horses. Remember when they had horses, Jean? And I saw Kath's horse and I saw Sharon's horse. And Sharon's horse had a wild eye. And I didn't go near it at all. I kept away from it. You could see it in the eye. It was broken, yes, but I don't think it was under control. That's no reflection on Sharon. You could see it in the eye. Give me half a chance and I'll have it. And so we find here, it means to be under control. Now we would say, in fact, it's used to describe, it means, these are two of the things it means. One, a domesticated animal. It also means this, to be angry at the right time, never angry at the wrong time. That's another meaning for the word. Especially in relation to people. Never to be angry at the wrong time. Only to be angry at the right time. And it speaks of someone under self-control, but really we know. I always used to laugh when you say you've got to watch him or watch her, they've got a nasty temper. I've never come across anybody yet with a nice temper. Never once. You push anybody to the breaking point and you'll see another creature. It unveils itself. And so we find here that this man is not self-controlled, or this woman's not self-controlled. She is God-controlled. Humble, just like the Master himself, who humbled himself. And now, meekness. A man or woman under God's control. The next one is long-suffering. We would know it as patience. Patience. Never, the type of spirit that never gives up. Especially in reference to people. That's patience. That's what Paul is talking about here. He is talking about humility. He is talking about gentleness. And he is talking about patience. And in patience, it is especially reference to those that deal with people, that they never give up. It's written by one writer of the Roman world that their army, they could lose a battle, they could even lose a campaign, but they never lost a war. They would never give up. Now, whether that's true or not, but that's what the Christian is supposed to be. Never give up. Not with yourself now. It's in reference to your dealings with people. When they apologize or whatever more, and they come back and bite you again. That's the worry that Peter had, wasn't it? And Jesus said to him, when Peter said, how many times shall I forgive him? And he was expecting, 7 times. No, 70 times 7, Peter. Patience. Now, these are things that test every one of us, don't they? Challenge every one of us. The next one, forbearing one another in love. Forbearing. It means bearing up, or holding up, sorry. Now, there's 3 types of holdings up in that. There's a hold up, where you're delaying someone. Judith met someone shopping yesterday, and I had to meet this family around about 9:30 in the morning yesterday, and time was moving on, it was 25 to, and she got out of the door, not realizing she was late. She said, you'd never guess who I met. That's the thing. Just held her there. Just held her there. It doesn't mean that. It's not holding up like that. And there's the other type of holding up, which we know is a stick-up, isn't it? It's that type of thing. It's not a stick-up either. It's not robbing you of anything. This holding up means literally that. Holding up. Holding up. Of taking the weight. Of being patient. Of being gentle. Of being humble. forbearing one another in love. This word love is a lovely word. I always thought there were 3 words in the Greek language. They tell me in Gaelic there are 21 words for love in the Gaelic language. In English, you can love ice cream, you can love your children, you can love your wife, you can even love God, all under the same heading. We're so minuscule in it, our language. It's a lovely language, they tell us. I can't give you my own thoughts on that because I can't speak any other language. But they tell me that there's not 3 words for love in Greek, in the original language here, but there's 4. And this one is the 4th one of the 4. And it means unconquerable kindness. That's a phrase that one of the translators have used. Unconquerable kindness. It's not passive, it is very active. It determines to love. It determines to do. It is not something that is just in the heat of the moment. It is something where a decision is made, and though it might cost you, you still do it to help the one beside you. Though you know it's going to cost you, or the possibility is going to be there. So those are the 4 great elements, or 5 great elements that we see. Humility, meekness, patience, forbearing, love. These are to be our companions. Now, I don't know what you are like, but my mother always blamed my friends for my behavior. I had one pal in particular, in fact, his mother is still alive, lives the next street over where I live today. And she used to blame me, and my mother used to blame him. It was always the same. But sure, these are to be our companions. These are to be our friends. These are the ones that are to be near to us. Paul highlights the struggle that we have with this. Because in verse 31, you can turn to it if you want, but in verse 31, at the end of the chapter, he says, now look, let there be no more. Let there be an end to all wrath, anger, loud quarreling, evil speaking, and all malice. These are often my companions. Now, if I look at 63 years, I can look back and tell you of times where there's been wrath. I can tell you of times where there's been anger. I can tell you of times when there's been loud quarreling. I can tell you of times where there's been excess malice and evil speaking. These, let them be no more. And let these characteristics, let the fullness of God bring these characteristics out. And by bringing them out, these other things will quickly part company. They'll no longer be your companion. They will no longer dog and trouble you, like that Yorkshire Terrier that can nip at your ankles each and every time. Now, David has got a Rottweiler. They've got a settee for him. I remember when we first went over to visit them, both him and Sean, and I think his name is Boyo, if I remember right enough. Judith was panicking because of her fear of dogs. So I hinted, I said, well, couldn't you just put him away into the kitchen? And Sean just said, well, if we did, he'd come through the door. Because he just doesn't like being left alone if he knows there's people in the house. He's not nasty. And she said, you'll find that he'll back himself into you, and there is one purpose. And he literally does. He puts himself in, stands in front and reverses back in reverse gear, and he has one inclination only, that you'll scratch his hind leg. Now, he's a big dog, he's a very passive dog. But my mate, that boy, whose mother always used to blame me, they had a Yorkshire Terrier called Pip. He was the nastiest bit of dog I've ever come across. He would sit at the back of your chair or at the back of the settee waiting for you to move. And as soon as you move, you'd hear this little squeaky growl. I wouldn't squeak with it. But, you know what I mean? He had my mate on the back of the neck. They had another Yorkshire Terrier called Yogi, and he was as thick as two short planks. Completely different nature altogether. And when a Labrador came into the garden and sniffed at Yogi, Pip flew at it and was hanging on that bit of flesh that's underneath there and would not let it go. Would not let it go. You see, we are dogged sometimes by things that will not let us go, or we won't let go. So Paul said, let us bring an end to that now and fill your life with these things. He writes to Titus, doesn't he? Think on those things that are good. Let's move on. Verse 3 tells us, verse 3, endeavouring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Now, when we go for a walk, there are times when Judith and myself will walk, people say, oh, you're awful fit, you go for a walk. Sometimes I just stroll. I'm not doing... If a walk is going to do you good, you've got to lift the heart rate. You've got to do it. And you've got to do it for a set period, or at least a measured period of time. You've got to lift that heart rate. And when we talk about here, about walking, this is not a passive stroll. This word here, endeavour, it means make haste. And there are times when we set off to walk up to the Watford Chapel from Martin's Farm. We walk up, and we get to the top and turn right down towards the Blackcock Inn, down into Blackbrook Lane, and then out at the bottom end to come through Castleview. We'll do that. And there are times when Judith sets off, she's got a determination. I said, look, by the time we get to where the Miners' Hospital is, we're not going to be able to breathe a word. But I understand what she's getting at. You've got to lift the heart rate to do you any good. And here we have this. It means make haste to keep the unity of the Spirit. When you walk with haste, I don't mean dashing about. I don't mean, like a headless chicken. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is that there's measured purpose in there. There's measured direction in there. You're making haste to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And so that's what Paul is talking about here. For a walk to benefit us, then the heart rate has to be raised. We understand when they opened the prison door to Joseph that he made haste, wouldn't you? You'd make haste, but that's what he did. He made haste. He got out of there as quick as he could. And when Moses met with God up on Sinai, it says that he made haste. We understand why. Because he saw something so wonderful, so glorious, that he just felt that he had to rush to bow before him. And so he made haste. Here, we are to make haste, endeavouring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Well, let's bring it to a close. Verses 4 to 6. Paul speaking about this unity. There is one body and one Spirit, one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, above all, through all, and in you all. Amazing the number of times in the book of Ephesians that Paul brings in the whole of the Godhead together. You notice that? So very often he brings the Godhead in. 1 minute or one verse he's talking about, or even in the same verse, talking about the Father, then he's talking about the Son, then he's talking about the Spirit, and he brings the Godhead together. And you find with the Godhead, with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, there is never a contradiction between them. They are in complete unison. Complete unison. You have that with some dads will know this when he coaches rugby team. If you can get a team, they don't have to be the biggest. They don't have to be the quickest. They don't have to be the best. But if you can get them to work together, they become something that is very difficult to overcome. They may not have the best players. They may not have the best qualities. They may not, but if they're working together as a team, something clicks. And it's exactly the same in church life. When you have a group of people together that are not necessarily the most qualified, that are not necessarily that has the most privileged background or the best of backgrounds. You can bring in Tom, Dick, or Harry, and you can bring them in together, and when they begin to click and work as a team, you have a demonstration of the Godhead itself. where the Father, the Son, and the Spirit were completely in tandem with each other, never contradicting, having the same intent, having the same purpose, having the same direction, having the same wish. And the church of God, what Paul is saying here, he said, these qualities that I've spoken of can bring us into such a line of unity. But you've got to make haste for it. You've got to march for it. You've got to fight for it. Seems almost a contradiction, doesn't it? To fight to be unified. But you've got to do it. And so Paul says, now look, there's one body, one Spirit, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, through all, and in you all. What a marvelous God we've got here. Complete unison. This is what Jesus prayed in John chapter 17, the last verse. Father, I pray for those who believe in me, that they all may be one, even as you are in me, and I in you, that they may be one in us. In the 70s, there was a famous front row. They called them the Pontypool front row. And songs were written about them, and all those different things that were written and said about them. Graham Price, and then the other two. I can never remember the other two, but I'm sure people could tell me. But the hooker, they all worked in the steelworks. They all worked in Penyrheol steelworks. And the other man who said this on one occasion, he said, I might go back when in a scrum now. I might go backwards. I might go sideways, but I'm not going down. And that's one of the qualities that they had. If you looked at him, you think, well, where would he fit in to modern day rugby then? Pot-bellied. And all the rest of it. How could he? But there was a sense in that trio there that they worked together. And they were able to bring a stable foundation for the rest of the team. Yeah, there were stars in there. There were wonders in there. But you've got to work from the principle of working together for those qualities that you've got to be really brought out. To be really brought out. For you to say that this is the world that I love to operate in. Mark used to say to me, they tell me I've got a very hard head. And when the kids were younger, when the boys were younger, they used to come up and they'd push me with their forehead there. And I never lost. They wouldn't bang me, but they would push again, head to head. And whether it be Mark, who was 6'3", or Jeremy, 5'11 3/4, he's never been 6 foot, no matter what he says. And they would push their heads against mine. And I would look triumphantly at them, like, you know. And then Mark would say, now come into my world, down on the floor, down here. And he'd have me all shapes in seconds. You've got qualities given by God that needs an environment for them to operate. And the best way that they can operate is in the unity of God himself. That's when they really come to the fore. That doesn't mean everything is sweet and easy, no. Why would you need to be patient? Why would you need to be humble? Why would you need to be controlled? Why would you need to have a love that determines, I'll never give up on this? Doesn't mean everything's going to be sweet, but he gives you the qualities. These are not man-made. They're qualities that God himself possesses. And they come through his fullness within our hearts. Now, once we cover that point, Paul then goes on to say, now you can move on into your ministry. And he talks about, and we'll have a look at those, God willing, next week. May God grant to us a heart that can receive that fullness and also then, not just receive it, but show, reveal, walking, revealing the nature and character of God. Well, time is gone.